Welcome to Better Than We Found It, the podcast for leaders driven to leave a positive mark through their leadership.
I hope that I will have created some ways in which the circumstances of your birth don't predict the opportunities you have in your life.
I'm Josh Huggins, your host and the founder of GS2 Partnership, a search firm committed to connecting visionaries dedicated to environmental and social betterment.
I have 2 young sons. I want to be able to tell them I did use the resources and expertise of a company to try to create more awareness about climate change.
In each episode, we delve into the minds of executive and future leaders. We discuss how sustainability guides responsible leadership, sparks change, and drives value.
The way of thinking I try and advocate is for us all to think about us having a collective problem to fix, which is climate, and that we need to rebuild our global economy.
We are GS2, and we are on a critical journey to connect to those who believe in leaving the world better than we found it. Hello, and welcome back to Better Than We Found It. It's a pleasure to have you with me. On today's show, I'm joined by David Carlin. For those of you who don't know, David is a prominent thought leader within sustainability and the founder of Cambium Global Solutions, an advisory business working with a range of organisations, institutions, and the United Nations on the developing areas of sustainability and climate risk. Within the show, David talks about his original career in quantitative analytics and banking, through to his journey at Oliver Wyman and to today in leading his own consultancy. He's an extremely well educated and knowledgeable individual on the topic of climate and sustainability risk. He has a huge wealth of knowledge, but also network within the space, and I think imparts some really interesting ideas, insights, and views for the future of sustainability, AI, technology, and the overall societal shift that we need to go through. So I'm sure you're going to get a lot from the episode, and really looking forward to hearing your feedback. So let's dive right in. So hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Better Than We Found It. And David, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, it's great to be here.
So I've just done a little introduction to you, but I'm sure that I haven't done it as much justice as you can. So would you mind, for the audience who don't know who you are, give a bit of an overview of yourself and I suppose your current business and why it exists?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am the founder of Cambium Global Solutions, which is an advisor as well as a solutions provider for governments, financial institutions, and companies looking to accelerate their commitments to sustainability, think about the risks that a changing world faces, and ultimately bring about a more vibrant and resilient future as a result. And through that work, I've done a number of other engagements and also roles, both presently advising the UN and heading up the work on risk for the UN Environment Programme's Finance Initiative, and taking a number of both academic and advisory posts across the sustainable finance and climate landscape.
Excellent. Well, I'm really looking forward to get into that in a bit more detail. But as I can tell from your accent, you may not be from this side of the pond. So tell us a bit about your childhood, where you're from, and what those prominent memories of your early years were.
Yeah, so you're correct in that assertion. I'm from the U.S. originally. I grew up outside New York and went to school in Massachusetts. My first job actually was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which by comparison, of course, to New York City is a bit more of a smaller town feel, even though it's still a city. And I think one of the things that, as I was growing up, and certainly in the years right after, I finished my studies, were kind of a search for a community and a search for real topics of passion. I knew that I really enjoyed doing quantitative work. I also, though, enjoyed the work of tutoring, the work of being hands-on, and trying to think about how to bring together some of those more analytical pieces with some of the more personal interests in getting involved in at the time, not as much environmental, but more educational and economic justice and access were some of my big priorities. But I think a lot of that had been cultivated early on, just with my family, spending time volunteering, also spending time as I got a little bit older out in nature. I would say that kind of planted, to use that ecological metaphor, planted the seed for both an appreciation of the natural world, but also a very hands-on practice of being out front and really trying to connect with people, trying to serve, and also to take the skills that I'd been accumulating professionally and bring them into that service of others.
Sure. So I suppose purpose, therefore, was something that was quite prominent at the beginning of your life then. But how clear were you on a career path that you could take to focus on that back then? Because clearly the industry's evolved so much since then. But at your time, how were you clear about what you could do or what that could look like for you in years to come?
I have to say, I really was not very clear on what it looked like. And in fact, much of my work and involvement had often been either entrepreneurial or more side of desk or even kind of in a voluntary sense. So in the first job that I had working in model risk and model validation at a bank, I also ended up leading the volunteer committee and working on trying to mobilize many of the young professionals at the institution for a number of social causes around the city. And so I always very much saw the work that people did and knew, of course, there were full-time organizations, charities, NGOs, nonprofits, but also thinking about where is that sweet spot of impact between scale and size and purpose. And so a lot of my experiences had been at the margins, running volunteering programs, essentially at one point, then starting my own nonprofit to build that kind of community that I mentioned was important to me before. But I always saw these things as something that I hope I could do more of, but how to fit that in and how to also balance the practicalities of this entire working and business world, which clearly has so much to do both with providing the solutions, but also with many of the challenges that we do need to solve for. So it was always a little bit of an uneasy tension between how much I'm doing. And I remember, and I think I'm safely away from it to talk about printing up flyers on the company printer for evening events and activities, and realizing that that I think was a good encapsulation of the distinction that these things matter, and they matter at a human level, but at an organizational level, how do you actually bring those things together?
For sure, because I suppose back then, being in that sort of banking environment, heavily regulated about what you probably can and can't do, or even say, maybe publicly, or what they would like you to do or say. But how did you start to, I suppose, understand how, particularly finance and banking can, if it's used in the right way, I suppose, influence those societal shifts?
So I think a lot of that began with some of the work that I had been doing, even though there had been a fair amount of work, as I said, volunteering, thinking about fundraising for local community organizations. I think a fair amount of that actually came when I took a sabbatical and worked with a fintech company called Kiva a number of years ago. And the idea there was really about looking at a new way of getting people into the financial system and into the credit system. And that was through this notion of social trust and both peer-to-peer support, but also the idea that a community would back someone. And this wasn't a new idea. In fact, it's been around for since we've lived in communities. We think about social trust. And it was something that the Nobel laureate Muhammad Yunus brought forth in his Grameen Bank in the 1980s, but trying to do this within the US context. So we were part of a group called Kiva US, working with local individuals. I think one of the things that really showed was, one, how catalytic access to the financial system is for people to grow and have the economic opportunities they deserve, but also what kind of levers finance had. And of course, as somebody who started my career in the shadow of the global financial crisis, there was, quite an awareness of the impacts that finance could have, but not as much the directed part. Thinking about it, the analogy I would give there is, it's a little bit of, you understand the power of water when you're standing by the sea and you see big waves. It's not until you kind of think about a dam and a turbine that you really appreciate the ability to direct power in a certain way. And I think that was one of the things that, recognizing through a number of financial innovations, opportunities to do that. And then on a number of advisory projects that I'd worked on while at Oliver Wyman, working on things like community development, financial corporations, and other vehicles that financial institutions have used to both promote community growth and also promote impact in the places where they're operating was certainly very revelatory.
Sure, understood. So you mentioned Oliver Wyman there. So how did that move come about to join the firm? And then secondly, what was it about the organisation that really appealed to you at that stage?
Yeah, so I had been working for a few years at PNC in Pittsburgh, and I was looking to do something that was a little bit more fast-paced and a bit more dynamic in terms of not only getting to see one organization, but many. And at the time, given, as I said, kind of in the shadow of the financial crisis, there was a lot of work around stress testing and a lot of work around redeveloping the model suites for risk across the financial system. There was a strong desirability for those skills. I'd been from New York originally. I was also thinking about just where I would be, and I was kind of torn between loving being in Pittsburgh and the community I had there versus the familial connections and the opportunity. And so from that standpoint, I thought it made sense to try something new because, as I've sometimes joked with people who have looked at consulting, I say consulting is kind of the liberal arts of the business world. It's something that doesn't specialize you. To be specialized as a consultant is almost a contradiction in terms, because it's your adaptability, it's your ability to gain skills. You may have great expertise in a field, but the fact that each problem isn't going to be cookie cutter, because otherwise why pay for a high price solution when there's something that's going to be just off the shelf. And so to me, that was a really exciting thing. It was also at a time when I was kind of at a fork in the road between, do I continue to explore new things in the business world, or do I take a doctorate in behavioral economics and potential exploration of consumer financial behavior? So I guess going back to your earlier question, I've always seen the impact and power of finance in terms of decisions and decision making, but not necessarily in the same systemic way that I did, after working with Kiva. But I think it was a number of those factors of looking for something that kind of met the pace that I was desiring to round out my education, but in a but not in a classroom sense, in that school of the real world. And I also think I really liked the people that I met. Of the number of consulting offers that I had, I felt like I not only got along well with them, but there was also a bit of an opportunity to step back a little and be a bit more of a generalist. Not that I had been brought in for reasons other than the experiences that I had, but an opportunity potentially to work on some other projects. And so doing ones on pricing with a retailer, working on other topics that weren't directly in the financial space within my first couple years was, I think, also just a helpful way, one, to reconfirm where I was headed, but also to gain some skills, whether in further data analysis or further connections between the generation of insights and the connections with behavior.
Sure. So which practice were you part of in Oliver Wyman, and what were the types of, if you give us some assignment and sort of programs of work you were focusing on?
Yeah, so I had initially come in as part of their core consulting group. So really just in the main pool of management consultants, but ultimately aligned to their financial services practice, and then specifically into their finance, risk, and public policy work. And that was where I stayed through my time there to become a principal in that group, and worked with a number of institutions really throughout the world, but throughout the financial system as well. So banks, as well as asset managers, private equity funds, insurers, and really thinking about how those challenges evolve. And the nice thing with consulting is that the questions you're going to be facing are going to change. I could say every 2 years, but depending on the topic and depending on the field, they'll vary. But the things we started off doing, those more traditional post-global financial crisis stress tests, then gave way to questions of overall solvency and stability, and those themselves kind of led into a series of maybe non-traditional financial risks, and how we measure those, whether those are operational risks, and indeed it was this kind of non-traditional set of financial risks that initially led me to climate risks as a project topic, which was at the time something that maybe had been explored academically, had been discussed scientifically, but few institutions, if any, really had developed models or approaches for trying to size what effect a changing climate would have. And as you may know from most models, the real challenge is this notion of what we call stationarity, which is that one set of data isn't going to meaningfully change over time. There isn't a trend in it. That's how we can feel comfortable using the past to predict the future. Climate upends that in a very profound way, because it's inherently about a future that's different than the past. And so because that behavior isn't stationary, it means that many of the approaches that you attempt for a stationary approach, if I want to know what my orders are going to be next month, I could probably look at last month. And if I have a lot of data, I can probably look at this time last year, or I can look at the last 5 Februaries as an example. But when it comes to something where the behavior is by definition changing, then that's going to be something that's particularly important to address. And so it was through work like that I began to become better acquainted with climate, and in many ways, with a number of parallel threads in my life, saw something that really captured a lot that I was particularly passionate about.
Sure. And it's amazing when that point comes where I suppose the different drivers and motivators from your life so far kind of meet in this melting pot, where you realize actually this is the thing that's really I'm getting really passionate about. But not everybody gets that. And I think in our recruitment and executive search business, we see people who are constantly searching for that. So it must have been a good moment when you realized this was something that could be have longevity, but also commit to that purpose. I think that's important to recognize. However, I know that also social impact was something that was always prominent for you. And then on the side of your desk, you started to serve as the social impact manager, as I understand it. Could you talk a bit about how that came to be and how you balance that work with, I'm sure, a growing workload in the climate risk space?
Yeah, so one of the things was that I ended up doing a number of kind of side of desk engagements and things that were very focused on things that I cared a lot about, but weren't necessarily ones that were as well hooked in commercially. So I really have always enjoyed writing. I wrote a number of columns both on social issues as well as on historical issues for both academic publications and popular press. But I kind of did that because it was interesting. It was different than the work that I was doing. When I started the Active Citizen, which was my nonprofit to bring together young people in New York to both learn about social issues and volunteer, I was also, doing some of that outside. I brought it a little bit more in-house by beginning to run the volunteer work at Oliver Wyman within their New York office, and then also taking on the role of leading their social impact work while there. But all of those kind of, to me, in a lot of ways, felt like scattered pieces. And with climate and with this topic, a lot of that really coalesced. The interests that I've had for a long time in social impact, these questions that I'm always very interested in, both scientifically and in the social sciences, and the ability to bring a lot of the skills that I had built up over a decade of work in financial services and in risk modeling to bear on a new topic. It was kind of a neat way to bundle them all together. And sometimes I joke about climate is a great way to pretend you're an expert while you're a generalist. That if you tell people you're working in politics, and you tell people that you're working in science, and you tell people you're working in finance, and you tell people you're working in social impact, all of those feel like these very disparate topics. But if you put climate in front of them, then it all kind of grabs a coherent heading. But in some ways, it's that systems thinking which is so critical. And what is something I so appreciate about it is it's not just a convenient way for me to put my hobbies together, but it's that each of these elements and areas from my life provide some unique insight into how I look at a problem. And when we're looking and needing systemic solutions, it isn't just a luxury to be able to bring together, questions of writing and communication with questions of impact and an ability to measure those things, but it actually becomes a necessity. And so, to me, this was a really valuable way to do that, and one that I certainly really greatly appreciated, and and still do appreciate in the work that I do now.
For sure. And talking about systems thinking and I suppose sort of bigger picture, how did the relationship with the United Nations Environment Programme Finance Initiative come to be? And could you tell us more about that role and how that sort of transpired Oliver Wyman and through to your current Cambium Global Solutions as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So the work with the UN was in as I mentioned, getting involved in climate risk kind of came about because the UN was looking to do a project convening many of our bank clients on this topic. And there wasn't necessarily an approach, but this new framework had just come out called the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD. And at the time, it was a new framework. It was answering a question, which was, why are we falling short on climate change? Why are we not taking the actions needed? And it posited an answer that this was, like the financial crisis, a market failure, an informational failure, and better information could help to change that. And so that was very much up my street in terms of both interests in looking at some new types of risks, the potential social dimension of it. But as a result of that, there was not only an opportunity to work with this UN group on trying to come up with that new approach for beginning to measure and then ultimately manage climate risks, but also then a longer opportunity for us not just to have that initial project, but to continue it on potentially through a secondment. And so I initially came over having done the project in order to prolong that work, because we were trying to figure out how we would continue in this important space that at the time was also very pre-commercial. And so this secondment was kind of this happy approach, which left me as a consultant to the UN and still with links to Oliver Wyman. And then over time, as I got my footing, the work that I did there grew from focusing on transition risks, so the risks of the low carbon transition on different business models, to then broadening out across all of climate risk, and now expanding into a center that we've launched at the UN called the UNEP-FI Risk Center. And the Risk Center really is focused on all environmental and social risk issues that financial institutions will confront. And along the way, I realized where I was feeling particularly motivated and passionate in bringing these threads together. And so decided to ultimately take on that role more full-time with the UN. And as a result of that, coming aboard as an advisor left me in a bit of a position where I had some freedom of movement. And at the same time, because these topics were so new, I was also just getting a large range of inquiries. And sometimes I joked that I was kind of a very informal ESG headhunting service, because I would get friends asking, hey, we're hiring for this sustainability position, or hey, I'm looking to get into this field. How do we do it? And a lot of that matchmaking and just being within the community really, to me, suggested that people were interested to hear the perspectives I had, but even more than that, to hear how they could become more involved, more connected, whether at an individual or an organizational level. And it was that kind of impetus to try to amplify the effect that I was having that led me to start Cambium, and to focus not just on a portfolio of convening work, which the UN is fantastic at, but also of some of the implementation work that I so enjoyed in my time at Oliver Wyman, and some of the advisory work, which I had been kind of more and more getting asked informally to do from various executives and leaders.
Sure. And what you've described there, I suppose, in terms of those different types of arrangements and focus areas, does need a variety of different skills, behaviors, backgrounds to deliver them. How do you think, as an industry, we can encourage more individuals who want to lead perhaps more of a purpose-led career to develop or to learn that, I suppose, cross-pollinated skill set that you clearly have and that's been so successful for you, but perhaps others may not be in that position of? What would you suggest?
It's a terrific question, and I had written a piece for Forbes, actually. I spoke when I was at COP28 in Dubai with one of the co-founders of LinkedIn, and LinkedIn, of course, has a wealth of data on professional skills, on professional roles. And one of the things that we talked about was this notion of a skills gap, and recognizing that some of those are new skills where we just simply don't have enough people right now. How many people know how to audit sustainability reports? The answer is not many, which is why standards like ISA 5000 and others are being put together so we can develop competencies as an industry and overall. But there's also a number of soft skills that I think make one effective in making the transition. And those, involve the synthesis and aggregation of information, the connection of big picture to the details, the use of data and insights to drive decisions and to ask the questions of, is this decision useful? And also to look at what kind of impacts are being had. And so I think the skills needed are very much a combination of the hard skills. Of course, if you're going to be doing carbon accounting, well, then understanding, for example, the GHG protocol, which specifies how different types of emissions should be considered is quite important. But it's less about any of those particular skills as much as it's marrying those particular skills with some of those really important soft skills. I think it's even more critical to consider those soft skills of communication, of interpersonal relationships. Of course, the UN is a great area for people from all over the world to connect, and not only learning the cultural sensitivity, but understanding different perspectives comes with that territory. But climate itself is a global problem. So whether you're working at the UN or you're not, the different stakeholders you face, they may not be as far-flung as across the world, but they may be from different communities that are being represented. And so that bigness of mind, that ability to think in a way that is both systemic, but also takes the perspective of others, I think those are really critical skills. And then as we home in on particular areas, particular jobs, many of the things that have really marked our technological age the last few decades are only all the more important when we're talking about all of the particular feedbacks. Climate science is at this point nothing else but a huge trove of data, because so much has been collected. We're well beyond simple equations and into supercomputers. We're into thousands, if not millions, of satellite and local observations. So we have this wealth of data. And now the question is, how do we avoid drowning in the information we have? And how do we put it to good use? And I think the other thing that we also need, which combines kind of temperament and skill as well, is this ability to act under uncertainty. I sometimes say that climate and sustainability are treated differently than other parts of finance for this, which I don't think is the right way to do it, which is we don't have data, we don't have information, so we can't act until we have it. But all of finance is about that. If we knew exactly who would repay, well, then there would be no need for diligence on loans. If we knew exactly which companies would flourish, then investors would only put money into those companies. So uncertainty is an inherent condition in our lives and is a acutely visible condition in the financial sector. And I think the willingness to decide under uncertainty and to act under uncertainty is critical also for those who are interested in the sustainability space.
Yeah, for sure. And what do you put that down to? The I suppose the general mindset of inaction based upon uncertainty purely in sustainability. Why do you think that that's been so prominent in recent years?
I think there's probably a few reasons. If I had to try to pull together three of them, I would say the one of the big ones is just the science is something that creates what I've jokingly called climate amnesia, and very intelligent people that will say, I'm not a climate scientist, and then proceed to either say something ridiculous or proceed to totally tune out a discussion. And the goal is we don't need people to understand every element of atmospheric science, but there's something about this that feels outside the wheelhouse of many. And I think that that's unfortunate, because many of the most successful entrepreneurs, many of the most successful investors in the last few decades may not have been the most expert coders, may not have been the most expert hardware designers, and yet we're able to understand trends, understand the way things are changing, and capitalize on them. And that's what we need smart people to do. So I think the first reason is a little bit of that area of kind of, this isn't my expertise. I think the second is there's a bit of an inaction problem of, if the cost of inaction is negative, but the cost of bad action could be potentially worse, what is the dominant position? And inaction feels like that dominant position. Very often those calculuses are wrong. They're mistaken. So to say, oh, well, doing nothing is going to be better than doing something, but the wrong way. In many cases, doing nothing itself is actually fatal. It's not going to lead to success. And so while companies will fail on this journey, many of them will succeed. If you imagine to use the canonical example of the buggy manufacturer, if you're not going to look at all at internal combustion engines around the turn of the century, eventually you're going to be out of business, or exclusively giving your tours in Central Park or in some similar place. And so you can choose not to act, but that is a guaranteed loss. And I think sometimes people on that kind of game theory sense get those wrong. And then finally, I think there's a little bit of this, which is a view that it isn't core yet to my business. And this is a time horizon problem. It's one that we're thinking too short term, and we're saying, well, my job is hitting quarterly earnings numbers, or my job is to get my end of the year quota. And these things intercede, but they intercede in very irregular ways. The change in financial markets due to climate, the change in even weather conditions themselves, these things are lumpy. And while they take time to play out, they also come in the form of strong storms, of financial volatility, of these things. And so for people overall to develop a plan directionally, it's a little bit, the analogy I would give is a person who's trying to lose weight. Well, you cannot eat all day, but that's going to be a bigger problem for you in the short term. And yet at the same time, realizing that you have to eat doesn't absolve you of the need to eat a healthy diet if you want to be healthy longer in your life and healthy throughout. And so the two together is that feeling of I need to eat is something that I think many fund managers, many executives constantly feel. And they're not wrong about that. I think, sometimes we make short-termism into this negative because it's the opposite of long-termism. But it, for many of these executives, needs to be a both and situation rather than an either or. And I think it's those things. It's the failure to consider the long term. It's the inability to make the right calculation in terms of taking action versus inaction. And then I think, as I said, it's the subject matter piece. And I think all of those are reasons that kind of push back against action, even though it's clear that it's needed.
Sure. But these things that you discuss and talk about are clearly not individual problems that company by company can solve. These are societal issues. These are system issues. These are where finance really needs to play its part. I think what I would be keen to understand from you is considering, and we spoke about this offline, but you have built a huge following on LinkedIn around your thought leadership around sustainability. How do you use that platform effectively to try to encourage this change? Because whilst in your advisory capacity, of course, you can deal with the United Nations, you can deal with individual organizations, but actually this platform you're building can probably affect things slightly more than maybe you even realize. And I don't mean that in a condescending way, but you have a voice that people listen to. Do you think about that when the things that you're posting or your thought leadership and actually the societal impact that you try to have with your platform?
Yeah, it's really, I think, been an interesting experience the last couple of years as my public profile has grown, and LinkedIn has been an important vehicle in that. And I think one of the things that I've realized is how much people appreciate understanding a summary of what's going on so they can begin to make decisions. And the sheer volume of information can be paralyzing. And so I think in one of the things I try to do, I really do aim to make things clearer to people, to simplify, to try to get to the so what's so they can get on with the actions. Because whenever I'm working on the advisory side with a firm, I really say I'm working with the individuals. It's empowering them to make the change. They're always going to have more of an impact. And so whatever I say is only going to be amplified if you get those right amplifiers within the organizations. And so giving them some of the knowledge and tools, I think, is one thing that's been really helpful. The other thing is, I think from a discourse standpoint, this is a complex topic, a challenging topic, and often a frustrating one. And so I try for the most part to bring a degree of if not positivity, then clarity on progress and a willingness at the same time to call out actions that I think are hampering that progress. But I think despite the fact that we have a set of social media companies that are predominantly focused on amplifying the loudest voices at both ends, I found the community within LinkedIn to be one that is really receptive both to thoughtful discussion, to civil discussion, and a willingness to consider the nuance of arguments. And I think that's important. And then lastly, I think there's a bit of hoping to inspire people and connect people. It's really wonderful to boost the terrific work that so many of my collaborators are doing, so many of my friends are doing, whether in the academic sphere, whether in publications or in legislative priorities that are moving forward. But it's also great for others to become aware of that, not just because it empowers them, but because of the connections that they make with each other. And so within London, I tend to do a monthly climate meetup where we just have a very informal group of people getting together over drinks. And part of that is recognizing, again, what I said at the beginning, that there's real value in community, and the network effect is so many more than just the individuals. It reminds me of going back to the statistics training I had of the handshake paradox of, if you have people in a room, how many handshakes do you have with 30 people? And what you start to see is, you don't have 30 handshakes, but essentially you have a near factorial of that, because each one is shaking hands with 30 others or 29 others. And you realize that the effects of networks are a lot more powerful than that of any one individual. And so to create a bit of that network space, I think is something that is, a thing I value both in the real world, but also on LinkedIn, but also something that I particularly take joy in seeing as it's facilitated.
For sure. Well, I won't ask you the tough question of how many handshakes are there in that room, but I'll ask you a similarly challenging question on your view on AI, and I suppose how, if we take it from a positive standpoint, what's your view on AI and how it can enable us to accelerate this transition?
So I think AI is one of the most important technologies and suite of technologies. I think we are really too narrow when we think about AI in saying, what will AI do for climate, or what will AI do for business, is a little bit like saying, what will the internet do for business? It is a fundamental change in how things are going to be done, but it's going to change it in a million little ways. So those looking for suddenly, if you're right on the lines and you're a copy editor, there's definitely direct competition. If you're working in a space where there's a clear and direct competition, and white collar jobs are beginning to feel some of that, you'll face that. But I think it's so much broader than that. And I think it really minimizes the impacts that it can have to think of it as a single technology, as much as it is an extension of the abilities of workers. It's an extension of the abilities of organizations. And of course, there's a number of downside risks. And I serve on the advisory board looking at ESG for the Responsible AI Foundation. And we're working on exploring some of both the positive and negative uses, both in terms of things like energy use and misinformation, but on the other side, optimization, logistics support, early warning systems. And I think you really see a diversity of use cases. In the same way, it's nowadays, although there are some apps that do it, and they're invariably depressing when you look at the results of how many times you pick up your phone in a day. AI is going to be like that in the coming years. Of how often did you use AI today? Was it 3 times? You won't even be able to decide, because you'll be working and proofreading something with AI. You'll be searching for things, but that search will be augmented and shaped by better prompts that are put into it. You'll be gathering information, and that information will be, and already is, curated by various algorithms that are constantly learning and improving. And so I think AI has a huge role to play. The caution I would give to it maybe is not the traditional caution, because I think enough people have spoken about energy use, they've spoken about misinformation. What I would say is AI is an accelerant. And people have talked about the human age, the last 100 years or so, being the Anthropocene, the age of man. Others have called, the time post-World War II the Great Acceleration in our ecological footprint, in our economies, and in many places our standard of living. But I would say that AI is an accelerant too. It allows us to do things faster. And the old, I envision, a 60-something-year-old standing up in front of a class, in the 90s, talking about the computer being the world's fastest idiot. Well, that idiot just got a whole lot faster with AI, and maybe isn't so dumb, but the point of directing things toward the wrong aims becomes all the easier, but also directing things in the right way also becomes a lot easier. But it's the difference between, if we're walking on the street and we bump into each other, it's probably not catastrophic. If we're biking, it's probably pretty bad. If we're driving, it could be downright deadly. If we're in two airplanes, the results are completely catastrophic. And so recognizing that we're going to be zipping around the world with AI, both gathering information, propagating information, and thinking about these things. There's a ton of ways to make sense of new data, and we have so much of this that we need to get beyond what humans can do, because in the same way, Control F is something that everyone is familiar with when you're looking for something on a page or in a Word document. There's certain things that people are really, really good at, and there's certain things that we're not so good at. And when it comes to reviewing thousands and thousands of reports, we're going to need to shift that manual burden onto things like AI. It's going to be the only way that we'll get meaningful decisions from it. And so to me, I'm really excited. I'm, of course, a bit nervous, as everyone is, but I think that this is why we do need to be clear-eyed, but it isn't a genie to be put back in the bottle. You can say our business doesn't have a website now, or you could say our business doesn't accept credit cards, but both of those things we're seeing, the effects as they die out. And I think in the future, you could say our business doesn't use AI, but it will be the same kind of antiquated Luddite, like, oh, that's something that feels like of a different era. And I think that is the world that we perhaps inhabit more than we even think.
Sure. Well, it's back to that inaction point you mentioned earlier. Inaction on anything like this, global megatrend such as AI, will leave you in a position to be floundering, I suppose. A couple of final questions then as we wrap this up. So we've spoken about, I suppose, technology. We've spoken about environment and climate. But back to one of the earlier points we mentioned around social factors. What do you think are some of the social factors that we should be aware of, or perhaps could stop the development that's needed to achieve what we need to transition?
So I think that the social factors are critical, and we have to really avoid replicating the same inequalities and injustices that marked the prior hundreds of years of global development. And people might say throughout the Industrial Revolution, people might say the colonial age, people might say the early modern period, but you can really go back, and the fact is we have very often recapitulated many of the same mistakes time and again. And it is that idea of going back to the AI point, a little bit of what operating system are you using? If we're going to use the same operating system, as I said, a lot of this is about these things are accelerants. They are going to make people more successful, but also it's going to make things more unequal as well. We saw that with the internet. We're seeing it with AI. We're going to see it with the transition if we're not thoughtful and careful. And I think that idea of a set of pure winners and losers is not only dangerous for social cohesion, but I think it actually may sow the seeds of its own destruction, in the sense that we saw this with the Yellow Vest protests in France. We've seen this with the attempts at pushing back against various ESG policies within the US, that if people feel like they are not getting a fair deal, if they are being asked to shoulder the burden, I think that there is very much a mistake that we're seeing anti-ESG pushback solely as this tool of the far right. And a lot of the people that are skeptical are ones also that are not sure where they fit within a new system. And it's not just the canonical coal miners, but it's also folks that may need to pay to improve the energy efficiency of their houses. It might be people that are looking at the pump and saying, okay, well, if you're going to put a tax on gas, that's going to hit me, not the guy with the Tesla. And so equity needs to be critical here. And just transition has been on the lips of virtually every CEO that I've spoken with, and in conferences and meetings and private conversations, but very few people can well define it, and very few people can tie metrics to it to say, what are we actually doing? And this is where we actually need to get serious and realize that if we treat this like a talking point, we're going to very quickly hit that wall of, oh, well, we could paper it over, we could tell people we care, but eventually the results are going to become obvious for themselves, in the same way that in many countries, as social safety nets have eroded, as opportunities have diminished, we've seen that frustration rise, and there's only so much rah-rah that you can do without realizing that there's a need for structural change. And so I think avoiding repeating the mistakes of the past is critical, but also keeping a really clear eye to how to do this in a way that works for all and provides opportunity for all is going to be just not only a desirable path, but perhaps the only path.
Right. Sure. Yes, a challenging thing to approach, but as you say, absolutely critical. I was going to ask you about your hopes for 2024 in sustainability. I appreciate it's a general question. So to be a bit more specific, if there were 3 things that you wanted to see more of in 2024, and perhaps 3 things you wanted to see less of, what would they be?
That's a good one. So six things. So let's. I'll start my engines on this. 3 things I'd like to see more of. First one has to be real impact, and that is not just about commitments. It's not just about frameworks. It's not about paper, but really about seeing that in the investment statistics, seeing that in power generation statistics, seeing that in the shift in energy mix, and those are tangible signs. So I want to see more of those. I also want to see firms begin to recognize that 2030 is the world that we're living in right now. The capital allocation decisions that they're making today are going to have impacts on the business that they have in 2030. So if you want to know what world we're going to be in 2030, look around you, because that world is the one that's being created right now. And I don't think there's enough appreciation of that. We love at each of the UN summits to talk about, oh, well, 2030 is only 8 years away. 2030 is only 7 years away. 2030 is only 6 years away. Well, at a certain point, capital allocation decisions, strategic planning decisions, these things take time, and they have a degree of path dependency. And I think an appreciation of that is really critical. I'd also like to see globally us, and this is the reason I didn't mention this first, even though it's the most sprawling and ambitious, is I'd really like to see us get along better as a species. This is one of those real planetary tests. And countries have had tests before, communities have had tests before, families have had tests before. But this is something that we are all in together. And it is obviously not only heartbreaking, but also massively counterproductive when we see the money that is being spent on destruction, and especially destruction of fellow people as this goes on. So really to say across the world, to realize that there is this commonality, and it's not just a shared humanity, but a shared space, that we are operating in a way that affects other people. And those butterfly effects aren't abstract here. They really do matter, whether you're producing something halfway across the world or right in my backyard. There's effects that we need to continent and think about. On things I'd like to see less of, I'd like to see fewer commitments that are not well thought through. I'd like to see commitments, but ones that are backed with the organizational power. I think one of the biggest mistakes in commitments that has happened so far has been a lack of appreciation of how strategic a shift aligning to net zero is. I think that a lot of the way that these came about were through these kind of control failures of, oh, well, this isn't that important, so we might as well sign it. And in the same way that, you got to read the fine print, I think this is a good example. So I want to see more carefully considered commitments. I'd like to see country action also really step up. Last year, after Sharm el Sheikh, there was an expectation that countries could enhance their Paris commitments as well. Some took the opportunity to do so, but we still need to see more ambition. And that may not necessarily mean moving the timelines up as much as it means adding to the details and adding to the policy measures critical to facilitate that transition. And then finally, I want to see more action rather than more waiting, if waiting is the negative. And then finally, I think the thing, I'd like to see less of is less time spent trying to tackle all of our issues all at once. And I think this is one of the challenges of the COP process. And it's one of the challenges of any of these big grand meetings, which is we create these bizarre horse trades of I'll reduce emissions if you provide money for adaptation. And these two things maybe are necessary and have some philosophical link, but ultimately we complicate our own lives and we slow action when we try to take these things all at once. So I want to see big progress made on particular intangible issues and not the notion of trying to run what I sometimes joke COP is if you think of the 3-legged race, well, this is the 400 something legged race. And so how fast can we actually move? I think once we start untying ourselves and thinking bilaterally, once we start thinking about particular issues, we can move a lot faster. So not trying to solve the whole problem at once is just a good practice in anything, whether it's life or climate.
Sure. So David, thank you for your insights so far. I suppose the final point that I want to understand from you is your own internal and personal legacy that you have, and how you would like to end your career showing or believing that you've left the world better than you found it.
I think it's a question that I sometimes come back to, but rarely in as grand terms as the end of my career, and sometimes it's more on a project basis for me. But I would like to step back to that question of how do I leave things better than I found it? And I think to me it's about the people that I work with. It's about giving them the power to make the changes in the places that they're working. I also think that coming up with some of the tools and approaches that can help facilitate that in a really scalable way is a big part of my desired impact and the impact I'm trying to have right now. But ultimately, if I could play a role in bringing people together, in helping them to find that change and make that change that they're so passionate about now, I think that is a real success. And so my hope is both to have personal impact, but to have an amplified impact, and that impact on those around me that I work with, that I'm in community with, and that I see as also the real torchbearers within their organizations, within their societies, within their communities to be able to make those changes.
Well, thank you for sharing. I've really enjoyed the conversation. It's been fantastic. Thank you for your insights, your wisdom, your perspective, and some good humour thrown in there as well. So I'm sure the audience will have appreciated it also. Now, you are very well connected on LinkedIn, but if there's others who aren't connected with you or would like to engage with you, is that the best place for people to reach you, or are there other areas that you would like them to reach out to you on?
You're very welcome to connect with me on LinkedIn. Sometimes due to the volume of inquiries, it's easier to reach me directly. You can go to my site, Cambium-global.com, and you're able to contact me and my team there as well. So would be delighted to hear from those who are interested in speaking more and discussing some of these topics with me in the future.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much. I'm sure there'll be lots of people keen to do so. I'm really keen to hear about how things progress for you. And I'm sure you'll continue to do the great work that you are. So thank you so much again for your time, and we'll look forward to catching up with you soon.
My pleasure. Thanks so much, Josh.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Better Than We Found It. I hope you have found value from this to support your own purpose-led journey. This episode was brought to you by GS2 Partnership, my organisation focused on providing talent solutions for sustainably focused organisations. We are driven by our purpose of connecting the people who believe in leaving the world better than we found it. If you are looking for a partner to support you with your hiring plans, or you are looking for your own career next steps, please reach out to us or personally drop me a message on LinkedIn. It's great to hear from listeners to the podcast, and I'd welcome the opportunity to talk to you. Thank you very much, and stay tuned for our next episode.